This month, February 2025, marks 10 years since I bought my first camera. Now, I bought that camera on a whim with no expectations that I would be doing what I'm here doing today. And the beauty of it all is that it has led to some pretty amazing opportunities that I never would have been able to experience otherwise. And when I started, there were not nearly as many photography channels here on YouTube as there are today. So a lot of the learning I did was through trial and error. So in this video, we're going to go over a couple photography tips that I've learned over the years to hopefully help improve your photos that I apply to my own photography every single time I go out and shoot. And hopefully this will help make you a better photographer in the process. Now, if you've seen my previous videos, then you will know that one of the most common techniques that I always try and use in my photography is the use of foreground elements. Now, of course, there is always a time and place where a foreground might not be completely necessary, but if you often find your photos lacking or kind of boring or looking a little too flat, putting something in between you and your subject will always help add depth to the image and make your photo just a little bit more interesting. One of my favorite techniques in this regard is using foliage to almost wrap your subject without actually crowding up a majority of the image. This barn photo is a perfect example of how you can go from this to this, just by stepping over a few feet. So it's important to always be aware of your surroundings beyond the subject that you are photographing. You never know what might be a couple feet beside you that you can find a way to incorporate it into your image. My other favorite way to do this is by just getting lower to the ground. So it doesn't matter the focal length of the lens you are using. Just by getting lower to the ground, it can help you compress that foreground and that midground element to help lead your eye directly to the subject of the photo. Now, the next tip plays directly into that previous one, especially when you are incorporating those foreground elements into your image, and that is choosing the right aperture. Now, just because you have a lens with an aperture of f1.4 does not mean you should always be shooting at f1.4. Now, in my personal experience, I've found that most lenses are typically sharpest when you stop down about 1 or 2 stops, so that f1.4 aperture becomes either an f2 or an f2.8. And once you reach that 1 to 2 stop increase, you will notice that your images will become drastically sharper, and it will help reduce any chromatic aberration that otherwise would have been present in your photo. Now, my personal favorite lens is the 35mm f1.8, but I don't always shoot at f1.8 just because I can. Oftentimes, my go-to aperture for whenever I'm going out and taking photos, not knowing what I might be photographing, is going to be f4. Because I don't always want that shallow depth of field, and I want to be sure that my photo is going to be sharp. Now, the same can be said for a lens like the 24-105, and even though the widest aperture is f4 compared to the 1.8 on the 35mm prime, you're still going to want to stop down the lens to probably about f5.6 or even 6.3 if you want to have the sharpest possible image. But if I'm shooting a photo that has a lot of foreground elements, I will often open up that lens to about f2.5 or even f1.8 because I don't want to have those foreground elements be in focus and possibly draw any attention away from the subject of the image. And plus, having them out of focus helps give the image more depth. So having a lens that has a wide aperture like f1.8 or f1.4 isn't always about shooting portraits and getting as much background blur as you can possibly get. You can use this to your advantage for any landscape or travel photo to help give emphasis to your subject. And even in some shots, like this barn photo for example, it almost looks like you are kind of creeping around a bush looking at this barn. So it can almost help give a shroud of mystery to your photo that makes it a little bit more interesting and maybe a little bit more enticing for any person who might be looking at your photo that might make them want to zoom in and look a little bit closer. Whenever I'm photographing a subject, so whether that's a car or some kind of building, I always make sure I get a variety of different angles. It's very easy to see an interesting subject and take a photo head on. It could be framed well and have a nice composition and good lighting. By no means a bad photo, but I often find that the more interesting image is when you approach that same subject from an angle, because it helps create depth and feel less flat. Often I find that this is where shadows end up looking the best and can help create stark contrasting lines. Now, I could make an entirely separate video about light and how you can use it to your advantage whenever you're shooting photos, But there's one important thing to remember. The entire point of light isn't simply to illuminate your subject, it's to help create depth in your image. And that's what most of these tips really come down to, simply just creating depth in your photo, whether you have good lighting or bad lighting. So next time you go out with your camera to shoot, experiment with your angles a little bit. Get that straight on shot from eye view, then one low to the ground, and then move to the side to get an angle on your subject and do the same. And then anywhere in between, find a way to incorporate those foreground elements into your photos. Now, sometimes light does not always work in your favor, and I'm not talking about the boring flat lighting that you would get on an overcast day. Quite the opposite, actually. I'm talking about harsh midday light. Now, there's a reason so many photographers avoid shooting in that harsh midday light, and for a long time, I was definitely one of those photographers. I would avoid it as much as possible, which left me with a very small window for taking photos, which would be golden hour in the morning or golden hour in the evening. But I found that the unflattering high noon shadows were not even the main reason it was so difficult to take a photo that I actually liked. But it was, in fact, the light itself reflecting off of pretty much everything. Specifically things like cars, and especially grass and trees. Now, I can work around shadows, but when you have light reflecting off of everything in your photo, it can often look very muddy, and it feels like there is too much going on to distract you from your subject. So I would recommend, if you don't already own a circular polarizer, then you should get one as soon as possible. They are typically very affordable, and they can often turn an unusable image into a usable image. Whether it's light reflecting off of foliage or reflections in windows on buildings, a polarizer will instantly improve your photo. It will quickly become your best friend, especially when you're on a road trip and you can't afford to stop and wait for golden hour everywhere that you may want to take photos. And the final tip may be the most important one of them all, which I think could arguably be said for all of the tips in this video, but this one pertains to your subject in a different way, and that is whether you should be shooting a horizontal or a vertical photo. I'm sure something all of us have fallen victim to at least one point or another has been only shooting vertical photos because of Instagram. Now, this is a habit that I've worked very hard on over the years to get rid of, because I think there is a time and place for both. Now, if you've seen my photo walk videos in the past, you will notice that often in pretty much every single video whenever I'm photographing a subject, I will try and get both a portrait and a landscape orientation photo. Because there have been many times when I'm out shooting photos where I only shoot a vertical photo, and then when I'm home editing, I think, dang, I really wish I would have gotten a landscape horizontal photo as well. In my experience, I've found that horizontal photos are best for capturing the full scene and setting the vibe, adding context to your subject, while vertical photos are best for subject isolation, whether it's a person, car, or building. Now, of course, there are probably always exceptions, but I find this to be the case most of the time. So it never hurts to always try and remember to capture both when you're out shooting, so that later when you are at home editing, you can decide which one you want to use. Like with a vertical photo, you will naturally have a lot more sky and maybe a lot more of the ground in your image as well, and it's up to you to decide whether you like that or not. Eventually, that will lead to you knowing pretty much instantly whether you want to frame your composition and your subject in a horizontal or a vertical manner. And in any collection of photos, I find that it's good to have a balance of both to help tell a story with a collection of images. Just make sure that with any photo you are taking that the subject is clear, whether that's a vast landscape, a person, a car, a building, whatever it may be. So those are 5 tips that I have to help transform your photography and help you become a better photographer that I apply to all of my images whenever I'm out taking photos. One thing I just want to make clear is just how important it is to just go out and shoot as much as you possibly can. Just have fun with it, and eventually over time all of these tips will become muscle memory, and you really won't have to think that much about it, and it will come off very, very naturally, and that is when you will become a master at what you're best at. But never become complacent, and always experiment and try new things as well. All of these steps can apply to many different styles and genres of photography. And what you learn doing one thing will always put you one step ahead with the next thing. So thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please like the video and subscribe to help support the channel. You can also become a member to watch the videos early. But in the meantime, hope I could inspire you guys to get out and take more photos. Go out and shoot.